which was sad because when he was buried here, he was a job.
Yes, he was so much time. He said it was that, and I think it's. My name's Mike Harrell, and I'm here to share with you my latest narrative series of work. It's titled Peas and Onions for Tea. It's a series of work that has an Anzac flavour, and it was based upon a diary that my father wrote during his wartime years in the early part of 1943, almost 70 years ago. The title itself came from an entry that my father made in one of his journals, and we can talk about that a little later on. But it starts in January of 1943, and the first painting is entitled Being Dive Bombed at 10 feet. And when you consider 10 feet, it's not very far away. And it was a terrible experience really for the whole thing to be initiated with. This diary really plunged the reader into the action very, very tempestuously at the start of things. And so whilst I took licence in depicting the painting, in the painting, soldiers involved would have been showing terror. In real fact, they would have gone to ground a lot earlier at that stage of the war.
Yeah, so what would give the expression to the paintings? Michael's painting, I think, very good characterisation of the face.
Yes, it draws you to the feelings of the soldiers immediately, the eyes. This particular painting too, you can kind of feel going along in a bumpy road in a probably very ill-sprung vehicle.
It also provides an image for the viewer of the vehicles they were using in the artillery at the time. So the little quad, that was an incredibly well-performed machine, and then the limber which they carried the ammunition in, followed by the field gun at the end, which it took 6 people to operate. So my father was a part of a crew or contingent, or a group as he called them, that operated that gun in the heat of the conflict.
Speaking of heat, I think that sun there, that relentless sun, leads well into the next painting, which has a hint of sunburn, or the soldiers, I think, there.
Yeah.
They look as if
pink bottoms and sunburn.
That's right, all very sun-baked skins, which would not have been from New Zealand. This is obviously a different sun they're working in.
Yeah. Here they had an abundance of water, so they used the most of it and washed, which they didn't get that opportunity very often in the desert. It's very hot and dry.
A lot of people have asked me when they get to the third painting, what's the figure of the Grim Reaper doing in my paintings, and then they start to have a look around. It's a bit like Spock Willie, is it?
Where's Wally?
Where's Wally in the books? But it is a style of painting that I felt was appropriate. As I got into this project, I realised there was an underpinning theme of the fragility of life, and I looked into the art history of European art, and I found a technique that was called the vanitas technique, which was popular in the 17th century, and that basically was a technique used often in still life painting, where the painters used different symbols that depicted the shortness of life, the fragility of life, as a reminder for viewers that you should stay humble in life and remember death is around the next corner. And so it seemed very appropriate to me as I went on into this series to use that image. So much so, if we step back a painting, one of the few paintings I actually touched up was this one, because I wanted to draw that into the shadows there. I wanted to bring more of that sort of imagery.
That's a good point that Michael makes. Most of your paintings don't show any sign of having been reworked. There's a speed and an energy which I've always liked about your work. And just about all of your paintings have that. It's as if you've caught the energy of the soldiers in action.
I was astounded at the amount of rain they got in the desert, but then the war was fought along the very fringe of the desert. It was the area that was very much in the news when the rebels were overthrowing the Gaddafi regime in Libya. And so it was interesting, when I was painting I was getting a lot of feedback on nightly TV about my colour choices, and I was very reassured the other night when an old veteran from the war attended our opening ceremony and said, you got it right. So to cut a long story short, that was about rain and it was about boredom. You know, the army was about hurry up and wait. There was a lot of that went on.
This is a boredom buster activity going on here.
And also keep the boys fit, and I think fitness was a huge component in the Desert War. The fact that our men endured it as well as they did in the extreme conditions and the discomfort that prevailed was largely to do with their fitness. And so every opportunity was taken. And this one just reminds us that not all war wounds were in the heat of battle. Some of my images are very quirky, quite a different slant on war, if you like, but just a reminder in the background there with the Reaper lining up for his bat as well.
Again, yeah.
But it is about, this is what war is, as you say, a lot of boredom. What was, can't speak to presently.
The roller coaster, the emotional roller coaster from one moment to the next, from 1 hour to the next, from one day to the next, from days on end to days on end of nothing. Just the more I unveiled things in this diary of my father's, which was really a series of notes, the more I realised that there was a whole lot of emotional. There's a big emotional journey going on here, which was a huge roller coaster. That it just on a cursory look at the diary was completely inapparent to me. This project has probably taken me 12 years. 10 of those were researching it. And actually synthesising and digesting and thinking, now what actually was going on here? And so then it became, you know, this project is really not about my painting, it's about the journey that I've been on to actually connect with the experiences of men about my father's generation who went through this wartime, you know, roller coaster ride, really. And that's all I can describe it as, because the uncertainty and the incredible juxtaposing of emotions becomes very apparent as you really get into the work. So I'm just hoping that that comes through to people generally and that the work has a broader appeal.
Talking about our father's diary being like notes, somebody the other night made the comment that Dad invented text messaging because his diary notes are so terse and so spelling reduced that it was like a kind of text messages that he noted down each day.
This painting's about when Churchill visited the soldiers in the desert. He was codenamed Mr. Bullfinch, and they all knew that there was Churchill, but it was a big parade, a big event for them.
As a prelude to this, I took an excerpt from Winston Churchill's speech that was given to the leaders of these troops at Tripoli after he had the parade that day. And in it he acknowledged the contribution they were making and said they were heroes and that their people at home thought they were heroes. And he said that their stories would be long told in song and in verse long after they had died. My father's been dead 21 years, and I see this as another chapter and verse of Winston Churchill's story.
This one here, the minute I saw it, I thought of Van Gogh's painting of the cafe in Arles. The light, the colours are
Complementary colours.
But it's the nighttime scene, and in that incredibly bright, clear air that some Mediterranean areas have. So
the men were given a job to unload the boats because the damage that port had incurred so much over the preceding months was such that the lighters had to bring the supplies to the quaysides. And it was done at night, and they were being bombed at times by the enemy. In my dad's diary, he made references there that I think they're actually quite excited by that work because it stopped the boredom. They were in camp for 3 weeks at Tripoli waiting to supply up and get going again, and they were actually fatigued but also bored. And so he really enjoyed that experience.
Yeah, the expressions on the faces, I think, is what captures the
Looking up.
moment.
It's almost like a cyclopean eye.
Yeah.
We will win in the end.
That's appropriate. They were on the Mediterranean.
This picture is actually really important because I was talking with the leading New Zealand military historian, Ian McGibbon, who is from Dannevirke, a local person who I know reasonably well, and I was talking recently and he said to me that the soldier diaries, like my father's one, are actually the unfound treasures of our military history in this nation. And the reason he said that to me was because he said they tell a different story of the events that happened. Now in this particular painting, my father's diary entry is completely different to the entry that was in the official record that was put out in the 1960s. And it's a pretty graphic situation he was in, and I think my father was probably right. And so when you're digging dead soldiers out, and the military record says that there were no soldiers killed, then it's they haven't really consulted a lot of people.
Remarkable landform of dwellings.
Huge tourist place now, of
Yes.
course.
I suppose they get through with their eyes on the horizon.
Oh, and time, it's true, they've been travelling a night and a day, and they were just, they were sort of spaced out and so now.
Because in the diary there's absolutely no mention of these very unusual dwellings.
And yet, in the official record, there's a page about it.
Yes.
So there were these incredible differences between what was my father logged in his diary and what the official record spent time telling us about. And it's the same in the next painting. All the official record talked about was the beautiful scenery and the lovely aromas of the flowers that come after the rains. And all my father talked about was how hard it was to dig the guns in.
Very big day.
Yes.
Very big day this time. Yeah. It's a big day on in action. They used to work. Apparently they used to run the gun when they were in extended action periods. They'd drop down to 2 or 3 men to
Rest.
to try and get some rest. But it was a very arduous physical job in the hot sun. Yeah.
How many rounds does he say they shot that day in their gun?
46 rounds, 6 guns, 531 rounds.
Yeah.
Very big day.
Yeah.
It's heavy ammunition you're moving with.
But it was the impact on their bodies too. My father, I make the comment at the bottom there, I recall a comment my dad made that his ears often bled when he lay down to rest at night after days like that.
No earmuffs or anything.
Yeah.
And his hearing was impaired.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about that particular action was the soldiers were very, very confident that they were going to win.
Yeah.
There was an air of, triumph about it before they even started. They knew that they were on the winning side and they blitzed them. It was that sort of thing going on. They had to work as a team. There were 6 in a team. They weren't meant to operate the gun without the 6, but they often did. That was basically their business. That was what they were there to do in the artillery of that time. They fired 25-pounder guns,
Is that the
the likes of which is outside the Dannevirke RSA club.
Yes.
Yeah, so we've got the Grim
Reaper.
We've got a crow going over the top of the Grim Reaper, popping his hand in on the edge there. This story here is about a nighttime move, and it's for me that one's about the colour really as much as anything, but it's also about annoyance because in the picture my father's gun was damaged by the trailing vehicle in convoy, and he did show frustration with that, and it took them some time to get their gun in working order again when you read his records, and he did show annoyance. The interesting thing to me here though is that night one of these little pods rolled down the hill and several of the crew died. So it wasn't just when the bullets were flying that people were losing their lives.
And nighttime manoeuvres. That was
Without lights. Yeah.
we experienced some nighttime manoeuvres ourselves as children. We're going home sometimes at night. Dad used to, if it was a moonlit night, he'd turn off the lights and we'd be cruising along the Glengarry
The
Road.
night would be consternation personified.
We thought it was wonderfully thrilling, but our mother, I think, had a different view of our reliving the wartime lightless experience.
The next painting is really, you know, the more you unfold, the more you say, well, how did these people cope? And how did they get the resilience? One was the physical resilience, but how did they get the mental and the emotional resilience? They not only got it from the camaraderie of their colleagues, but they also got it from their religious beliefs. And my father was a devout Catholic, and he, in his diary, there was a great appreciation shown of those opportunities to celebrate the different forms of worship of the Catholic beliefs. And sometimes he used to comment that he felt very good after having had those opportunities. And at times they were very critical moments when he was exposed to extreme dangers.
This one I find very interesting because Dad's diary entry is in capital letters, strafed by the RAF, and in our world, writing in capital letters in electronic media is shouting, and I think he was shouting. He was so angry that they'd been attacked by friendly fire, and
people died, didn't they?
People died. But I think that frustration of soldiers inching forward and suddenly a friendly aircraft goes over and attacks them and they're all diving for cover. But it's also striking in that our father was a very quiet man. He didn't shout. It took a really, really difficult dog to make him shout on the farm. And so kind of to see shouting letters in his diary showed how...
And it only happened once.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very angry. And it strikes me because it must have been a big shock.
It was a big moment.
Yes.
And it actually happened twice. And the other thing about this painting is that war is confusion. And we know that. You know, there are movies made. 4th of July is about war is confusion. And so this is war is confusion because, you know, the plan was great, but the execution let them down. The Allies, i.e. my father, were supposed to send up an orange smoke, which they did. But what had happened was, my father was towards the end of the convoy, and the desert had turned to powder, and it was all dust in the atmosphere. So to the aviators, the pilots flying across, they didn't see the orange smoke. So no one failed. It was just the situation they were in. This is a defeated picture. It's, you know, it's biblical. I was thinking of Moses and the wilderness here, and you know, deathly figures, because these would have been broken men. They had given their lot for their side. Italian and German prisoners coming in hundreds. You know, when the surrender started to happen, the Allies had huge issues in dealing with the numbers in a humane and fair way, but they were broken men, and so I tried to capture that in the imagery. This happened several times towards the end of the action, because the diary is really at the very ending 5 months of the African War, which had lasted some 2.5 years. Peas and onions for tea. Peas, onions and flies for your protein. Peas and onions for tea was a treat. I got to realise that. My father actually mentioned the food a lot in his diaries, and in this particular one I put several days entry in because on day one they actually acquired a lamb from the natives, as he called them, and it looked okay, he said. They were finishing that lamb 4 days later. So if you think about that and what the lamb would have tasted like 4 days later, you know, I mean, leaves nothing to imagination, really.
What it would have smelled like.
So anything was good food by then. The other interesting thing to me, I made it theatrical. Like, in truth, these guys are probably in the ground. But I made it theatrical because my father says, we were eating the peas and onions for tea. RAF were over all day. We lost 2 of ours. Jerry shelled the ridge in front of us. Seen a Jerry fighter shot down, and we finished our leg. This painting is called Tired and Shaky, and it's really the closest indication in my dad's diary that he gave of actually breaking. And I couldn't really understand the entry when I first read it, and it wasn't until I really looked very carefully at the record of the military for that day that I realised what had gone on. It was at night time, and they were in a situation where they were being bombarded by German 88mm guns, which were hugely superior, technologically speaking, than the guns my father's group were using. And so the only way to combat that sort of situation was to get air power into the action, and to do that they had to identify exactly where the enemy guns were positioned. And it so happened that the enemy positions were on higher ground from where they were operating, and so basically the command drew straws, or as they say in the army, if they say go, you go. And they took 3 guns from each of not the divisions, but the batteries. 1 gun from each of the batteries was sent forward some 250 metres further forward from the bigger military group. And they were told to open fire on a target which was a crossroads further down. And the objective was, once that started happening, of course, the light show that you got with guns firing at night was no different to what it is now. The light show gave the Germans the opportunity to return the fire, and in so doing, the Allied signallers could spot and mathematically calculate accurately where the gun positions of the enemy were. So the idea was to get return fire. It didn't matter about these 3 guns. They were just going to be expendable. Those men were expendable. They were going to be blitzed. And my father said that the shells were landing all around them. And that he said at the end of that diary, he said, I'm feeling very shaky and I've been very lucky. And my brother recounted to me another time, my father said he was extremely lucky, where he hopped out of a gun pit one day and the gun took a direct hit and he was actually blown into the air and the last person out of the pit was killed. So, he knew real danger. And this is the most dangerous thing that happened in that diary to my father.
Just on that level, it's dangerous, but also this one makes me realise that you had sand in your eyes. You're trying to do a good job, but imagine the sand of the desert blowing up around you, in your eyes and your mouth, and still trying to accurately do your job.
Dad's diary entry said Roman ruins. I googled it up, and it's the biggest Roman amphitheatre outside of Europe that they were going past. I'm sure they did have a look at it, but it was of no interest. He had more comment to make about the state of the road they were driving along.
The job at hand. This is a rise of celebration and colour. I think the colours you've chosen to reinforce the message that they drove into town and were welcomed as the liberating army. That must have been pretty exciting after everything they'd been through, to see these were people whose lives they had vastly improved.
People were very receptive of them as the Allied forces came through. The interesting thing about this particular day was they drove out of that town and within an hour they were back into action again. But then they came back into the town to have a party that night. So, this was a high point, but during that same day they hit the very low point and people died again. So hence our Anzac popping on each painting. On either side, either on the Allied or the Axis side, there would have been loss of life happening the whole time during this period. So it's very, very thought-provoking to us as another generation. This is about boys with toys. Boys with toys. My father wrote, I went to bed at 1 a.m, a big gun alongside us opened up just as we got to bed, not much sleep, very weary, 170mm Jerry, easy day, big show starts at 11. And I'm thinking, what's all that about? So then I opened the official record, and they devoted a page and a half to this incident. What had happened was they had captured one of the prize German big guns, 170mm. They were frightened of 88mm guns, these men, and there were several of them. There were only 2 or 3 of these guns. And when they captured it, they captured it undamaged. So, of course, the commanders of the British said, well, let's turn it around and shoot a few of their bullets back to them and see how it works. Problem was, all the instructions were in German, and no one in the crew that evening trying to fire the gun actually knew how to work the gun. So they didn't have a clue which charged ammunition they should use. Now, when we talk about the ammunition for this gun, it was about this high, and it was about that round. Huge. It took several people to lift it into the gun. And of course, depending on what charge was put into the gun, determined the behaviour of the shell that went out of the barrel. And so when the gun started up, unannounced to these guys who were obviously very tired, my father was very unappreciative of it. What we don't know, what we are not told, is that at some stage of the night, one of these shells actually exploded as it left the gun. And actually, they were lucky that there weren't some severe injuries of their own troops. But it was boys with toys in the night.
This painting, I think, too, is another one of Michael's tremendous energy. You can kind of, the energy of the gun and the firing, but it's fantastic contrast with the weary eyes of the soldiers who slogged away to capture the gun, trying to get some sleep, and there are the officers playing with the gun, keeping them awake all night.
With this exhibition, we've released a limited edition booklet, and it's just 50 copies. And the cover of that book has this painting on it, so it's an image that has been used quite widely to promote this exhibition already. And it's called I Let It Go, ... what a man. and it's like, this is huge disappointment in a humorous way, and then my father laconically saying, well, what a man, you know, let our prize chicken go. We don't need to imagine too much to know what the chicken would have really looked like. So yeah, it's sort of a very humorous painting, but again we've got this imagery of the vanitas, you know, the sun setting, and these mysterious people in the background, and also the colours. I like to try and, with my colours, create an atmosphere a little bit like the work of WW2, the Scandinavian painter of the early part of last century, and he used to capture image through facial details and a lot of colour juxtaposing.
And the body.
The interesting thing about the entry my father made this day was that he said, let it go, what a man, Buzz and Dick went out, and then he makes a comment, we fired 69 rounds, which if you think a very big day was 60 rounds, so it's another big day. And then he says, very lucky, had a good sleep. And the very lucky, I thought, now what's the very lucky about? And what's this Buzz and Dick went out? And what happened was, they'd just about taken a direct hit, their particular gun, that afternoon. So they had this humour happening in the morning, and by the end of the day, Dad had just about lost his life, and 2 of his crew were wounded and went out, because the shell that was a random sort of a shell that came over and just about took them out and landed so close that 2 of them ripped. And apparently one of those 2 men got mentioned in dispatches for that action, because he was badly wounded, and yet he still helped them limber up their gun and their ammunition carrier and travel to a safer ground. My dad never mentioned the flies. We know the flies were there. We know they ate the flies because they couldn't avoid it. But he mentioned the mosquitoes at this stage of his diary, and he made the comment that they are just about driving him mad. And he mentioned them for 2 or 3 days in succession. So he'd come a long way before he finally was starting to break because of the insect issue. And so, yeah, Monk's work came to my mind because it's really, this is psychological stuff going on here. Yeah, just your mind is just about to break, yeah. But by contrast, the next day my father's feeling almost homesick because he makes the comment that here the fields are covered in ryegrass and there is no dust, thank God. And that's the entry.
This painting to me looks like your classic wartime artist, the sort of thing that wartime artists go and draw soldiers off active duty right at the moment, but writing something, maybe writing in their diary, maybe writing home, maybe doing calculations, which we have a book where our father did a lot of mathematical calculations of the trajectory of the various missiles they were firing. And to me that's much more out of the classic wartime artist fold. The APRA's the only one.
And the improvisation, they did it wherever they could. And my father was a very reluctant writer. He wrote with his left hand. He had been in an era when, as a child, the school teachers smacked people for writing with their left hands and tried to correct that by getting them right-handed. My father never changed, but he was reluctant to write. So the fact that he wrote a diary at all during the war is pretty remarkable. The brevity of the diary is very understandable. And so, yeah, what also astounded me was that he had a lot of people corresponding to him and keeping his pecker up, as they say, and obviously he was writing back to them. And one of them was a teacher that used to smack him over the hand for writing with his left hand.
More as hell.
One of the other instances, we had with us the other night a World War II veteran, Mr. Bonnie Bodley, who we were so thrilled to have with us. And sadly my Aunt Ellen was unable to be with us the other night. But they were people my dad corresponded about and with in this diary. So we had a very, very intimate connection to it. Yeah, towards the end they had a little bit more furlough, I think, as the enemy was starting to more, be a beaten team, so to speak. And they got to the beach occasionally for a swim. And I'm thinking, here's a bunch of men that have been in the desert, young, energetic, physically fit men. If we look at it through modern eyes, we know what would have been in their minds at times. And so I drew on the heritage of the Odyssey, because we're in the Mediterranean here, to bring my imagery of the vanitas and, of course, the mermaids that are fluttering around here in the water ahead of the soldiers. Are basically that, that whilst they were tempting, they were also very faithful to a mariner that you didn't see before. But we're getting towards the end of the collection here, and I thought I'd portray an image from the German side. If you look at it, they were very technologically superior throughout this whole time, but they were being beaten. They were being driven back. At every action that happened, they took a step backwards. And my father made the comment at the end. He was getting quite, it wasn't cynical, I don't think. It was sort of almost a little bit of sarcasm. Good old, he said, just like old Jerry, sent over a few mortars. This is sort of the last 2 or 3 mornings of the action of this campaign. And, they were basically in the clean-up operation. The Germans were still sending a little bit back at them, sent over a few mortars. What my father didn't know was that it was actually the highest technological weapon that the Germans had brought into the war was actually rocket power that they were starting to work with. And we know from history that had the Germans had a little longer time to develop that prowess, then the result of the war could have been quite different. But yeah, the new birth for it, as it was actually not a mortar but a rocket firing. So, yeah.
You've got 2 vanitas images here. So you've got the Grim Reaper and the Sands of Time running out for the Germans. Perhaps
quite often we forget that, for all our Allied soldiers that we commemorate at Anzac time, we should also remember there were some wonderful people who died in the opposing armies. And that was one of the things that really struck me when we were in Europe and looked at the First World War battlefields. For all the battlefields that had buried Allied soldiers from the First World War, there were the same number of German buried in adjacent cemeteries. So it's, you know, war's not good, and we have been very blessed in our country to be preserved, that, you know, that our people have been preserved from having been engaged in this, on this scale, for so, you know, some 70 years now.
And this one, you've got a Vanitas, different Vanitas symbol here, I see.
My comment on this one, on each of the work I put a little comment on my own on the bottom, and my comment here is from T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland, and it's not with a bang but with a whimper, you know, and that's from the old child's rhyme, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang but with a whimper, said T.S. Eliot. And he was commenting on conditions at this time, actually. And if there was ever an anticlimax, it was this is it. Because these men had given everything. They had been exhausted emotionally, physically, and in every possible way they had denied themselves everything to get to this point where they had achieved their goal. And they were given 2 bottles of beer per man and plenty of cigarettes. There was no march for these men triumphantly through the city of Tunis. What they had was a parade of their own the next morning, and then it was straight back to maintenance to get their equipment and ready to travel back to what they called the Delta, which was back to the Māori camp, some 1,800 miles away back in Cairo. So yeah, I'm just thinking of how old I felt, you know. And my father said I got a bit of a spark up. That was my father's way of saying that I probably had one glass of drink too many. But you know, there was no real celebration. It was just a very, very Kiwi way of probably sitting around with their mates and thinking probably a lot about the guys who weren't there to also celebrate. And so that's why I've got the candle in there. Just to remind us that there were guys who should have been there, but they were buried back in the desert. So there's a very, as I say, this whole story just reminds us of what sacrifice and what service these people committed to, and then came back into our own country so far away, and then got on with their life as best they could.
Michael, thank you, because it's, I suppose as a child I saw Dad's photographs and they were all black and white, and you brought them to live in colour, and I know you've been not in Libya but close by, and you've seen these colours yourself, and you've brought a personal touch of some of our father's written experiences into visual, and I feel almost into action in some of them, because you've got so much energy in some of these scenes, and this one is reflective obviously, but I have a different appreciation for what Dan went through.
Thanks, Catherine. It's been a very interesting journey, and I would recommend it to everyone who has this sort of thing. And as I say, the stories are to be told, and the stories are still out there, and whether you do it, as Winston Churchill says, it will be done in song and in story. And so I've done it with paintings and story. And I thank my father, you know, for the story, really, because it's the richness that it's like, as I mentioned before, it's about peeling an onion. It's like as you found out something and you peeled that layer off, you found, whoops, there's another layer here, and you got deeper and deeper, and you got this incredible juxtaposing, you know, the extremes of what they had to contend with, eh? It wasn't just about flies, and it wasn't just about the heat, which is incredible, as Catherine said. It was about a whole lot of other things that were going on. And I think, you know, you ask yourself, how did they cope? And we've talked about that as we've gone around, some of the reasons my father was able to get through this. So thanks for that, everybody, and I hope you've enjoyed the journey. Mick Harold's 1943 diary from January to May of that year was written in the concluding months of the North African 8th Army campaign. He was in the Divisional Artillery, and his records extend through a 5-month period. The diary itself lay idle on our farm for many years, so much so that I didn't know my father had written a diary until after he'd died. It was my mother that alerted me to it. She gave it to me not too long before she herself passed away. And this is the diary. It was written in a child's exercise book. We understand that there are some pages probably missing from the original copy. My father wrote in pencil. He used the traditional cursive script, which was common for children who were taught, as they were taught to write in New Zealand schools at the time. And he basically wrote incomplete sentences. He misspelled a lot of the technical words that he was using because it reflected his own level of education, which basically didn't extend beyond primary school because of the Great Depression years. Catherine, do you want to make some comment?
And I remember Dad writing when we knew him, much later than this, and the difficulty that he wrote was because he was left-handed. His teachers had tried to reform him and make him right-handed, so he wrote with lack of confidence and with great difficulty. He didn't do that left-handed, he sort of did the throwing writing. So I imagine the difficulty that it was just to get these few words down at the end of a day when you'd been full on. Exhausted.
In so many ways.
Yes, that he still sat down and threw his hand across the page with the pencil.
Yeah.
It was important enough to record it. So that vests it with a great deal more interest and importance as far as I'm concerned.
When we found the diary, I'll just close it over to show you, it was like that. And so it passed as a pretty insignificant piece of paper in our house. And I think it was probably the way my father carried it, either in a top or back pocket through, part of that campaign. So, interesting. Everything tells a story here. Even the lines on the page tell us how the children of that time were taught to meticulously shape their letters and create the style that was the popular one of the time.
Yes, it's a treasure.
And as Ian says, Ian Gibbon, a colleague, an old school colleague of ours, who has done so wonderfully well in his own life as a military historian in this country, says that these are the taonga, these are the treasures, the military treasures of our nation for the years to come. And the interesting thing is, yesterday afternoon, another friend of mine brought in a diary written by her father, who was on the run in Italy, written on the same sort of exercise book. She actually had the cover of the exercise book still on, and it was intriguing because it was Italian war propaganda that the kids had on the cover of their exercise books.
Maybe that's why the cover was ripped off this one. I think
And
probably
where the book came from, we
follow.
don't know, because they hadn't been to Italy. So yes, look, food for thought, and we just hope that our story will prompt others to, look back and then look for the treasures that are surely there in their own families' lives, because the World War experiences of New Zealand, statistically, New Zealanders who have been here 3 generations or more have huge connectivity because of it. We all know why Anzac Day happens the way it does now. And for new Zealanders, the feedback I get with my artists, in their written comment, quite often, you are telling me why the people I meet are like they are. Which for me is very humbling, because I'm not sure what that means. I think it's something to do with our New Zealand way of doing things. I think it's our way of, like my father, he said few words, he was a man of action. He was humble. He didn't parade things. He wanted to be unobtrusive, and he liked to help the underdog. And I think it's a very Kiwi way of doing things.
I think that's a really nice way forward that you just mentioned too. That it introduces New Zealanders to part of our story. It's inclusive. I think that's a nice way to move these stories forward instead of holding them only in the past.
And as we've been advised, this is best now set forward to the Turnbull Library in time. The diary will be stored there because it will be the it will be the repository of such work from now on, and in 100 years, should historians want to research in more detail about particular eras, as undoubtedly scholars will, they will have a resource that they can collate and cross-reference with. So, yeah, we're very happy that our father's verse and chapter to Winston Churchill's Silent Story is going to be there for someone else maybe in the future as well.